talking about Descartes' project of tearing down any structure of knowledge which is not based on good foundations, that is, infallible foundations, foundations that couldn't be wrong, and then ultimately building it back. So we talked about the tearing down part and how he argued we could be wrong about any of our sense experience, our beliefs based on our sense experience, and if you could be wrong about something, you don't know it, and so we don't know anything based on our sense experience. That's just about sense experience. That's not the whole foundation of knowledge, because we have some knowledge that's not based on sense experience. So we have what is called, a priori knowledge. That's an I, right? And we have what's called a posteriori knowledge. Now, a posteriori knowledge, this is a colon, that's not a colon, that's an I, is based on sense experience. An a priori knowledge is not. Remember the distinction. This is our word. This is where our word prior comes to, and what we're getting here is this is prior to experience, knowledge that's prior to experience. Posterior is in this word. It's posterior or after experience. So what Descartes has done so far is undermined all of our a posteriori knowledge, our knowledge that's based on sense experience. That doesn't mean that we don't have any a priori knowledge, but he thinks even that knowledge of math, knowledge of logic, you don't get that knowledge by looking at the world with your senses. You get it by thinking about things. Right? So Euclid, when he talked about what happens with parallel lines and when a line intersects parallel lines and all that stuff y'all learned in geometry and probably hated, he wasn't looking at the world to figure that out. There are no parallel lines in the world, no perfectly parallel lines. For one thing, lines are infinitely long, and there's none of those in the world, of sense experience at least. And for another thing, there's no perfectly parallel, even partial segments of lines in the world. They might approximate perfectly parallel, but they're not exactly perfectly parallel. So what was he doing if he wasn't looking at the world with his eyes to say, oh, look, there's two parallel lines over there, and here's another line that bisects them or whatever, or I guess it wouldn't bisect them, but intersects them. And oh, look, hey, it turns out that this angle is equal to this angle, and this angle is equal to this angle. That's not what he's doing. So what is he doing? Answer, he's reasoning about it. So that knowledge that we have of geometry, of arithmetic, and things like that, we don't get it from looking at the world. So Descartes hasn't undermined that knowledge yet, but he thinks it can be undermined because you could be wrong even about that. And again, the same principle that I mentioned in the last video about the first premise, if you could be wrong about something, you don't know it, is going to apply because that's a general constraint. So if you could be wrong about 2 + 2 = 4, if you could be wrong about Euclidean axioms, then you don't know those things. I think you could be wrong about them. Well, Descartes says, again, imagine the evil demon. The evil demon deceives you into thinking that it seems really obvious. Because what happens when you hear 2 + 2 = 4 and someone says, is that true? You say, yeah, that's true. What are you basing that belief on? Well, what you're ultimately doing is you're just kind of thinking it through, and you're just like, God, that's just obviously true. If you have these two things, and you have two things, you put them together, there's 4 things. Okay. You're just thinking about it. You don't have to observe the world. Descartes says, imagine, though, that there was this evil demon again, and he could just make you feel like it was super obvious that 2 + 2 = 4, or make it feel like it was super obvious that this Euclidean axiom was true. To see that this is possible, just imagine it happening differently, that there was someone in control of your brain firing the electrodes in whatever the part of your brain is that controls things seeming obvious to you, and they just make it seem obvious to you that 3 + 3 = 2. And it seems just as obvious to you as it does right now that 2 + 2 = 4. So if your belief is just based on it seeming super obvious, that's what our beliefs about this sort of stuff is ultimately based on, then you could be wrong still, technically. And again, remember, could is very light here. If it's a 1 in a billion, if you're saying there's a chance, right, then it's possible that you're wrong. If Descartes is right that you don't know something, if it's possible that you're wrong, then you don't know that 2 + 2 = 4. Again, crazy claim. This is part of the tearing down phase. He thinks all of our knowledge is based on this shaky foundation because we could be wrong about any of this, even these basic claims in mathematics. Okay, let's talk. I'm going to talk about his rebuilding step, and then I'll stop the video. Then we'll move to an evaluation video. That'll be our fourth and final video where we evaluate this whole argument and project. And you've probably been having some doubts about whether steps of this argument work. I hope you have. And you might have thought, why is Justin not talking about this obvious problem? Why is it just, am I taking crazy pills here? We're going to talk about that in the fourth video. So let me just really briefly talk about Descartes' positive project. So he says, I'm going to tear it down, and then I'm going to build it back up. But when you build it back up, you need to make sure the foundation is better. And so you're tearing down a building that has bad foundations to build a building that has a secure foundation. So this is like the house built on the rock versus the house built on the sand. So what does he want to do? Well, you could get a clue for what he wants to do in rebuilding the structure. If he wants it to have a good foundation, what was his problem with the bad foundation? What was wrong there? It was that it could be doubted. It was that it could be wrong. All of these foundational beliefs we have, like our belief that what we're seeing is actually so in front of us, that my belief that there's a computer screen in front of me could be wrong. It's not impossible that I'm wrong. So what does he need to find if he wants a secure foundation? Answer, pretty obvious. He wants to find something that cannot be doubted, that we could not be wrong about. And you might be thinking now, what could we not be wrong about if we could be wrong about Euclidean axioms and 2 + 2 = 4? Well, Descartes has a really interesting answer here. He says, I'll tell you, there's one thing I've figured out that I absolutely could not be mistaken about. This is super clever. He says, here's a belief I have. I exist. That's the belief. I exist. So you think about it for yourself. Think of thought, I exist. Question, could you be wrong about that? Could you be deceived? Answer, there is no possible way that you could be deceived about that. Because if you were being deceived, you would have to exist to be deceived. So you could not fail to exist, at least as long as you're thinking the thought, I exist. Whenever you think I exist, something has to be there to be thinking that thought. Okay? So Descartes thinks, I can be certain, absolutely certain, that I exist. More certain than I am that 2 + 2 = 4. More certain than I am that Euclidean axioms are true. More certain than I am that there's a hand in front of me right now. So that's going to be his foundation. But now question, how do you build up other parts of knowledge from just knowing that you exist? Well, here's where Descartes' project gets a little bit shaky. So what he says is, well, basically what we have to do is figure out, how did we come to know that we existed? Well, I just had this very clear and distinct perception, which is utterly clear to me. Now, you might start thinking, this sounds a lot like the thing I said earlier, which it's just obvious to you that 2 + 2 = 4. And I think it is ultimately that. We have clear and distinct perceptions, or cases where it just seems obvious to us that something is true. But we also just said that we could be wrong even about those things, because the evil demon could be coming in and deceiving you. It's possible. It's not actual, but it's possible. So Descartes says this. He says, well, listen, if I could prove to you that a good God exists, if I could prove it to you based on solid foundations, then we would know that such a God would not want to deceive us. And we would then know that such a God would not give us a clear and distinct perception of something, or it wouldn't seem obvious to us that something was true. It wasn't true. Okay? So if I can prove that there's a God, then we can trust our clear and distinct perceptions. And then this is the way we start to build the knowledge back. Because then I start to say, well, I have it seems obvious to me that 2 + 2 = 4. Well, if you know that God exists, then you know that 2 + 2 = 4. You couldn't be wrong. And similarly with the Euclidean axioms, etc. Not really so with the sense perception, but we can push that off for a little bit. Let's just try to get math our a priori knowledge back. Okay, so Descartes has a proof for the existence of God. We actually don't need to talk about that. It's kind of divorced from his bigger project. He actually has two arguments for God's existence. But here's the problem. The argument depends on this claim. I have a clear and distinct conception of a God. And he says, if I have a clear and distinct perception or conception of a perfect being, this is a version of the ontological argument, which we didn't talk about. Well, if it's a perfect being, it has to exist, because a being is better if it exists than if it doesn't exist. So if I have a conception of a perfect being, then I have to have a conception of a being that exists. So this being exists. That's his argument. It's a weird argument, I know, but let's try not to focus on that right now. That's actually a little bit tangential. Well, it turns out that this gets Descartes involved in a problem. Cartesian circle. So here's the way it works. Let's have a little area off to the side. This is the way it was supposed to work. We have these claims. It seems obvious to me that whatever. And we want to be able to trust those. Well, let's actually put a claim in here, P. It seems obvious to me that P, and that's just going to stand in for any belief that you have. We want to be able to conclude from it seeming obvious to us that P actually is true. It seems obvious to me that 2 + 2 = 4, but I can't conclude from that 2 + 2 = 4 if I think I could be deceived. That's the whole argument we just went through. So how do we do that? How do we secure this transition from this foundation down here? Let's actually give it some piers. It's a pier and beam foundation to this, let's call this the roof up here. I'm sorry. I am the way that I am. Anyway, how do we get there? Well, Descartes says, we need to establish that God exists. And God wouldn't, in the wrong place, wouldn't deceive us. And that's what secures it. And that's woo, yeah, we get to go. You get to go from down here to up here if you get this over here. Okay. But how do I get this right here? Well, Descartes ultimately says, it seems obvious to me that God is perfect. So Descartes gives this argument that God exists. So Descartes needs to argue that God exists, but he does it by relying on the very thing that he's trying to use over here. So we want to be able to move from it seeming obvious to us that something is true to it actually being true. But in order to do that, we're ultimately relying on that very move. It's seeming obvious to us that God exists, and so God exists. And that's a circular reasoning. That's why this is called the Cartesian circle, right? So you can't do that, right? You can't say, I want to prove that our seemings are trustworthy. How do I do that? Well, let me rely on my seemings, right? I want to prove that my senses are trustworthy. Let me try to give you some analogies. I want to try to prove that that my vision is accurate. Well, let me prove to you that my vision is accurate. Look, I see a door right there. That's circular, right? Because I can't prove to you that my vision is accurate by relying on the accuracy of my vision. Suppose that there's a slightly more complicated one. Suppose you wanted to prove that God exists. So you said, well, the Bible says that God exists, or it assumes that God exists, and so God must exist. Okay, this is kind of a hidden circular reasoning. Because you should only trust the Bible if God exists, right? So you're kind of relying on the claim that God exists in order to prove that God exists. And so Descartes is doing something similar here. He wants to prove that we can trust the way things seem to us, or the way they seem obvious to us. And to do that, he thinks you have to prove that God exists. But in order to prove that God exists, he relies on the way things seem to him, right? So you can't use a tool before you make it, basically, is the way to say this. And he's trying to use the tool before he makes the tool. Okay, so I think we're officially actually into evaluation now. So I'll finish up this little piece and I'll make a short fourth video. So a lot of people think that they really bought into Descartes' project. We'll talk in the fourth video about not even buying into the project. But if you buy into the project and you think, oh man, he really did just destroy all knowledge, you don't know anything. Now, oh, but great, now he's going to build it back. But then a lot of people think he doesn't succeed in building it back because of the Cartesian circle. And so he's like the person who comes in and says, I've got a pretty good house here, but it's got a cracked foundation. Let me tear it down and build up a new one. So they tear down the house, and then they're like, oh crap, I don't have enough money to build up a new one. So now I don't even have a bad house anymore, right? So a lot of people think this is what Descartes has done, is that he's given us skepticism, the claim that we don't know anything, and he's argued convincingly for that. And he hoped to build back knowledge, but he didn't get to do that. Right, so now we're just stuck without any knowledge. All right, I'll stop there and continue in the next video.